April 13th, 1942. A small courtyard inside the central prison of Riga occupied Latvia. 6 o'clock in the morning. A 42-year-old man in a clean Wehrmacht uniform stands against a wooden wall. 6 soldiers face him with their rifles raised. The officer in charge unfolds a paper, reads the sentence aloud, refolds it. The prisoner has been finished with his last letter for 10 minutes. He hands the envelope to a guard. He asks the guard to please post it to a small flat in Vienna. His name is Anton Schmid, Feldwebel of the German Army, the senior non-commissioned officer running the Versprengten Sammelstelle in Vilna, a clerk's desk in a small office at the back of a railway station. A radio merchant before the war, conscripted in October 1939. The Wehrmacht court-martial in the same prison sentenced him on the 25th of February. What the charge meant in plain language was that he had been moving Jews out of the Vilna ghetto in army trucks for 6 months and writing each one down in a ledger. The exact count of those he saved was never agreed. 250 in the file the Gestapo handed up the chain. 350 in a Yad Vashem dossier compiled 20 years later from survivor letters. More than 400 in a memoir written by a partisan who had been one of the names in the ledger. Estimates differ. What is certain is that a German sergeant was executed by a German court for the crime of saving the people his own army had come to kill. And what is certain is the line at the bottom of the letter the guard slips into his coat pocket. The line his widow will read at a Vienna kitchen table 6 weeks later, holding the paper to the window because her hands are shaking too hard for the table. I only acted as a human being. How did a Viennese radio merchant in a Wehrmacht uniform end up against a Riga prison wall? And why was a German army that had already murdered 1 million people afraid of one small brown ledger book locked in a desk drawer 600 kilometers away? Anton Schmid was 40 years old when the war reached his shop on Brigittenauer Lande in the 20th district of Vienna. Married to a woman named Stephanie. 1 daughter, Gertrude, 11 years old, 1 apprentice, 1 cat, 3 small rooms above a courtyard, a workbench, a wall of valves and coils. He had inherited the shop from his father. He repaired radios for old women who paid him an apple strudel and darned socks. He kept exact accounts in a brown ledger, every transaction logged in his small, careful hand with date, price, and customer name. His Viennese training said that a man who does not write things down cannot be trusted with other people's money. That habit, the habit of writing everything down, will eventually save more than 200 lives in a city he has never seen, and it will eventually be the rope that hangs him. The conscription papers arrived in early October 1939. They took him because he was steady, because he could fix signal radios, because at 40 he was unlikely to run. He hated the boots that pinched. He kept his head down and did his paperwork. By the autumn of 1941, he had been transferred east, to a city the maps called Vilna and the locals called Vilnius. The German army had taken the city in late June. The Einsatzgruppen had begun the killings in the wooded pits at Ponary, a ravine in the hills outside town, almost the same week. By August, the Lithuanian auxiliaries were doing the bulk of the shooting under German supervision. By September, the Vilna ghetto was sealed. By the time Schmid arrived from his last posting in Smolensk, more than 30,000 Jews from the city had already been driven the 8 kilometers up the road to Ponary and were no longer alive. His posting was small. 2 rooms in a building near the railway station, on the eastern edge of the old town. A telephone. A Lithuanian clerk who could write German. A leather chair that creaked. His task was the Versprengten Sammelstelle, the gathering point for German soldiers who had become separated from their units in the long advance into the Soviet Union. A lost rifleman would walk into his office, sunburned, half-starved, and Schmid would ask for his name, look him up in the lists, write him onto a form, and hand him a meal voucher and a movement order back to the front. The dullest job in the Reich, he thought. He wrote to Stephanie in November that the worst part of the war for him was going to be the boredom. He was wrong. The day he began to be wrong was a morning in late October. He was walking back to his office from the railway canteen, a paper bag of bread under his arm, when he turned onto Subocz Street and stopped. A Lithuanian auxiliary policeman in a black uniform was beating an old woman in the gutter with the butt of his rifle. She had a yellow Star of David sewn onto the breast of her coat. She had stopped screaming. She was making a small sound that Schmid would later try to describe to his wife and would not be able to describe. He asked the policeman in his careful Wehrmacht German what the old woman had done. The policeman looked up at the uniform, lowered the rifle, and answered in equally careful German that she had been outside the ghetto without a permit and had refused to come along. He said it the way a clerk explains a regulation to a customer. Schmid stood for a long second. He thought about the ledger on his desk in the office 2 streets away, in which every soldier he processed went down in a column with a date and a destination. He thought about 100 small arguments he could make in the next half a minute that would let him pick up his bread and walk past. He made none of those arguments. He told the policeman quietly that he was taking the woman into his office for questioning. He used the only phrase the policeman could not refuse a German sergeant: by order of the Wehrmacht. He did not have such an order. Nobody asked to see one. He helped the woman up. He walked her 3 blocks back to his office, sat her in the leather chair, gave her his coffee, and locked the door. That afternoon, he hid her in a back room behind the radio cabinet. That night, after his Lithuanian clerk had gone home, he walked her down to the train yards and put her on an army goods wagon bound for Lida, with a note in his own handwriting addressed to nobody, requesting that the bearer be permitted to travel as a civilian laborer attached to a Wehrmacht workshop. The forged note worked. He never learned her name. He never learned whether she lived through the next winter. He went back to his office. He opened the brown ledger from his shop in Vienna, the one he had brought east in his kit, and on a fresh page he wrote one line: date, initials of a person he had never been introduced to. The single word, in his own small, careful hand: abgeholt, picked up. He closed the book. He had no plan yet. He had no network. He only knew, sitting alone in that office, that the German army had finally given him a job his Viennese training was good for. The road to that wall in Riga began on Subocz Street that October morning. Schmid did not yet know there would be a road. He thought he had picked up one old woman. By the spring, he would have picked up 200. By the end, he would have picked up more than 300, and the brown ledger, with every single one of them logged in his neat shopkeeper's handwriting, would be sitting in a Gestapo office in a city he had never been ordered to visit, waiting to be read aloud at his trial. By the middle of November 1941, Anton Schmid had picked up 4 more. A young man caught outside the wire collecting firewood, a woman pulled out of a column being marched up the road to Ponary, who had thrown herself onto the cobblestones and was being kicked by a Latvian guard. A boy of 14, hidden under a tarpaulin in a Wehrmacht supply lorry, found by a German private who said only, "I do not want to see what is under that tarpaulin, Herr Feldwebel," and walked away. A couple in their 30s, brought to Schmid's office by a Polish cleaning woman who knew another who had been hidden in October. Each one Schmid logged in the brown ledger book with the same steady accountancy. Each one he moved out of Vilna within a week. He was making the plan as he went, with a Lithuanian clerk who he was now reasonably certain was a quiet sympathizer, and a stack of Wehrmacht blank forms that nobody in Berlin counted closely enough to miss. The Versprengten Sammelstelle was, in retrospect, the perfect cover. His job was the movement of misplaced people. He could issue meal vouchers, movement orders, and Wehrmacht civilian laborer passes. He could write a note on Wehrmacht-headed paper, requesting that the bearer be allowed to travel to a named workshop in a named town. A Lithuanian sentry would salute it without looking. The note that worked best was on yellow paper. In late November, Schmid persuaded an army quartermaster to surrender a small stack of yellow Facharbeiter cards, skilled worker cards issued to Jews the army had decided, for the moment, to keep alive for their trades. A glazier, a furrier, an electrician, a tailor of officers' uniforms. The cards meant the man in the photograph was, for the moment, useful. The cards meant he was not yet on the next list for Ponary. The quartermaster gave Schmid the stack because Schmid had fixed his radio twice and brought him real coffee from the canteen. The quartermaster did not ask what the cards were for. He did not want to know. Every man, woman, and child Schmid moved out of Vilna in the next 4 months traveled either on one of those yellow cards or on a typed Wehrmacht note signed in his own hand. Most went west, to Bialystok, where there was still a working ghetto. Some went south to Lida and Voronovo, where small Jewish communities had survived. A few went into the forests, handed to partisans who took them past Schmid's sight forever. By Christmas, he had moved 60. The drivers were the next problem. He needed German soldiers who would carry passengers under tarpaulins and not ask. He found two. Wachtmeister Hans, a Bavarian Catholic farmer's son with a wife and 4 children, who had seen the pits at Ponery on his first day in Wilna and had thrown up against the wheel of his own lorry. Gefreiter Eberhard, a young Berliner who hated the SS in a personal, animal way that had something to do with a girl he had known. Schmid paid them in cigarettes, in cooking brandy, in silver coins from the small stash he had brought east from Vienna. Mostly he paid them in the small, careful sense that they were not the men the propaganda had turned them into. The third help came from inside the wire. A Jewish woman from the ghetto walked into Schmid's office in early December under a Facharbeiter card he himself had stamped, and after speaking with him about the prices of valves and coils in pre-war Wilna, she told him, very quietly, that there were people inside the ghetto who would like to talk to him. He walked in through the Subocz gate with a Wehrmacht pass and a clipboard. The electrician existed. He fixed nothing. The 2 men sat in a basement room for 3 hours, and at the end, Schmid had been introduced, by a young woman who would not give her name, to a man called Mordecai. Mordecai Tenenbaum was 25, a courier of a Jewish underground that did not yet have a name. He was thinner than Schmid had ever seen a man in civilian clothes. He asked 4 questions. How many people can you move in a month? How many drivers can you trust? How far can your paper reach? And, would you carry one of our couriers to Warsaw? Where the underground there does not yet know what has happened here. Schmid said yes to all 4. He went back to his office that night, opened the ledger, and added a 5th column. Destination. Through the winter, the pipeline grew. Schmid moved couriers in both directions, Tenenbaum to Bialystok and on to Warsaw in January. A young woman named only as Sarah to Bialystok with a typed report on the gas vans at Helmno that the Warsaw Underground refused, at first, to believe. A 15-year-old boy with a violin to Lida, hidden in the cab of Hans's lorry. The violin in a crate marked Wehrmacht Signal Stores. The boy lived. The violin lived. In late January, Tenenbaum brought another man to the basement, a young Wilna poet called Abba Kovner. Kovner was 23 and burned with a cold, articulate rage. He did not want couriers. He wanted weapons. On the first night of 1942, in a soup kitchen on Strachan Street, Kovner had read aloud a leaflet he had written, ending on one line, "We will not go like sheep to the slaughter." 3 weeks later, the leaflet had become an organization. In German, the Vereinigte Partisanen Organisation. In Yiddish, the FPO. Schmid told Kovner he could not steal a rifle from a Wehrmacht armory. He could probably steal a typewriter. He could carry papers. He would carry the leaflet to Bialystok in his own kit on his next leave. He walked back to the gate, saluted the Lithuanian sentry, and walked the 8 blocks back to his office. In his ledger that night, he wrote the date and the words, "a typewriter." He did not write the names. By then, he had stopped writing the names. He wrote only initials now, and only for those he had personally walked out. Anyone Tenenbaum or Kovner carried away went into the book as a single horizontal line. The Lithuanian clerk had begun asking why so many orders were typed and so few signed. He was no longer reliable. In February, with the temperature dropping below -25 on 3 separate nights, Schmid signed a Wehrmacht requisition for 40 pairs of felt boots from a stores depot in Riga and had them delivered, sealed, to the ghetto hospital. Sources differ on what happened to the crate. What is certain is that it did not stay in Schmid's depot, and that the requisition, with his signature, stayed in the Army's files. Before we go on, if any of this has stayed with you so far, subscribe to the channel. It helps more of these surface. Now, 8 blocks from Schmid's office, in a building on Mickiewicz Street, a counterintelligence officer of the Geheime Feldpolizei is opening a typed denunciation in careful Lithuanian and reading it for the second time. By the middle of February, Schmid had moved 200. The drivers were tired. The yellow cards were running out. The Lithuanian clerk had taken to leaving the office on small errands at odd hours and not saying where he had been. The Denunciation on Mickiewicz Street named a German sergeant who was running a smuggling operation out of the Vilna ghetto, using army lorries and forged Facharbeiter cards. The denunciation gave the address of the Versprengten Sammelstelle. It did not yet give the name. How long could Schmid keep moving people before the denunciation found a Gestapo officer who could read Lithuanian? And when it did, would the brown ledger book in the bottom drawer of his desk survive long enough to disappear? At the end of February, Mordecai Tenenbaum left Wilna in a Wehrmacht lorry driven by Gefreiter Eberhard. He carried 2 suitcases, one with forged Aryan papers for himself and 3 couriers, the other with a folded copy of Kovner's leaflet and a typed report on the gas vans at Chelmno. Eberhard's lorry crossed the bridge at the Valenka River at 4 in the afternoon, took the Bialystok road south, and reached the Belarusian frontier at Mosti by nightfall. The papers Schmid had written for the journey did not survive a careful second look. A Wehrmacht checkpoint sergeant, new to the post and irritated by the cold, asked to see the manifest. The manifest listed 3 Jewish welders being moved to a signals depot in Bialystok. The checkpoint sergeant looked at the welders, who were not men and were not welders, and were 3 women in their 20s with the wrong kind of soft hands. He held the lorry. He sent for the Sicherheitspolizei. By midnight, Tenenbaum was running through frozen fields back toward Wilna and survived because he was small and fast and had been running for a year. The 3 women did not run. They were taken back to Wilna and shot at Ponery within the week. Their names did not enter Schmid's ledger because Schmid had stopped writing names 2 months earlier. Eberhard was taken to a Geheime Feldpolizei building in Mosti and questioned. He held out for 2 days. He gave up Schmid's name on the 3rd. Sources differ on whether he was beaten or whether he was told that his wife in Berlin would be held responsible. On the 3rd day, a teleprinter signal traveled from Mosti to the Geheime Feldpolizei office on Mickiewicz Street in Vilna. The signal named Feldwebel Anton Schmid of the Versprengten Sammelstelle as the controller of an illegal smuggling line from the Vilna ghetto. Tenenbaum reached the ghetto on the 4th day, found Kovner, told him what had happened. Kovner burned what could be burned. The FPO's address book of partisan contacts went into a stove on Strassen Street while 2 young men stood at the door. The cellar where they had read the leaflet to Schmid was abandoned the same hour. A young woman was sent up to Schmid's office with a folded paper that said, in Yiddish letters only, "They are coming, the children warn you." Schmid received the note at his desk on the 5th day. He did not run. He thanked the young woman, walked her to the door, and locked it. Then he sat down in the leather chair that creaked and thought, for 10 minutes, about the brown ledger book in the bottom drawer. He could have burned it. The stove was lit. He had time. The book would have been ash before any Geheime Feldpolizei sergeant could climb the stairs. The men on his list would be safer. His wife in Vienna would be safer. He did not burn it. Sources differ on why. The simplest reading is the Viennese reading. A man who has spent 20 years recording every transaction in a brown ledger does not, in the end, burn the most important ledger he has ever kept. The book was the only proof, anywhere, that the people on its pages had ever existed under a name. He locked the drawer and put the key in his breast pocket. He sat down to type out his Friday paperwork. The Geheime Feldpolizei arrived at the Versprengten Sammelstelle at 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. 3 plainclothes officers and a Wehrmacht military policeman. They did not raise their voices. They asked Feldwebel Schmidt to stand and walk with them. He stood. He walked. At the door, he turned and asked the Lithuanian clerk to mind the office until the relief sergeant arrived. The clerk, who had been waiting 3 weeks and had typed the original denunciation in his own kitchen, said nothing. The brown ledger book stayed in the drawer. They came back for it the next morning. The first interrogation was in the Vilna Geheime Feldpolizei office on Mickiewicz Street. 48 hours. 2 officers in shifts. A scribe at a typewriter. They did not beat him. They had no need. They had the ledger by the 2nd day. And it answered most of their questions in his own hand. They went through it line by line. They asked for explanations of the abbreviations. They asked who LK had been on the page for the 7th of November and how Schmid had moved her to Lida. They asked about the felt boots requisition from Riga. They asked about Wachtmeister Hans, about Gefreiter Eberhard, about the Lithuanian clerk who, it turned out, had been corresponding with the Geheime Feldpolizei in writing since early December. Schmid answered the questions about himself. He did not answer the questions about anyone else. Asked for the names of his Jewish contacts, he said the woman who had brought the electrician had given no name. Asked about Mordecai, he said the man's face he could not recall. Asked about Kovner, he said he did not know the name. The Geheime Feldpolizei wrote down the answers without expression. They expected to get him a second time, in a different building, in a different city. Wachtmeister Hans was arrested the same Friday at the lorry depot, held for 19 days, and released because the only Jew anyone had seen him carry was a 15-year-old boy with a violin, and the boy was on a train somewhere east of Lida and could not be produced. Hans never spoke of Wilna again until his deathbed in 1973. On the 11th day of his detention, Schmid was transferred to Riga by train, in a closed compartment with 2 military police. He was permitted to write one letter to Stephanie. He told her only that he had been moved to Riga on duty and that she should not worry. He did not tell her that he had been arrested. He did not tell her that his case file already filled a brown cardboard folder 8 centimeters thick. He told her instead that he hoped Gertrude was keeping up with her piano lessons. In Riga, the building was different. The Wehrmacht held its own prisoners in its own prison, in a wing the Latvian guards called the German floor. Schmidt was given a cell 3 meters by 2, a wooden stool, a Bible, a blanket. He was given paper and a pencil because the Wehrmacht court-martial required that a defendant write his own statement of facts in his own hand. He sat on the stool. He sharpened the pencil with a fingernail. He wrote, slowly, in the same neat hand he had once used for his shop accounts. He wrote what he had done. He did not write what anyone else had done. He wrote, on the second page of his statement, the line that would later appear in the official record of his trial, and would later still appear in the last letter he ever wrote. I only acted as a human being. The Wehrmacht major appointed to defend him met his client for the first time 20 minutes before the court was called to order. He read the prosecutor's brief on the way up the stairs. The brief was 12 pages. Charges on the first page. The list of names from the ledger filled the other 11, with abbreviations in the margin, and Schmidt's own handwriting reproduced at the bottom. The major closed the brief at the courtroom door. He thought very briefly about asking for an adjournment. He did not ask. He had been in the army long enough to know an adjournment would only mean the same verdict a week later, written by the same men in Berlin. How does a German court try a German soldier for doing the one thing the rest of the German army was, on paper, not allowed to do? And when the verdict comes, will it be the verdict the law of the army requires, or the verdict the men in Berlin already wrote 3 months ago? The trial lasted 4 hours. The prosecutor read the charges. The defense counsel said what he could be heard to say, which was very little. Schmid was asked whether he wished to address the court. He stood. He said that the events as described in the prosecutor's brief had occurred. He said that he understood the law of the army. He said that he had acted as he had acted because he could not, in the moment of acting, have done anything else. He sat down. The court withdrew for 40 minutes. It returned at 4:30 in the afternoon and pronounced the sentence the men in Berlin had written 3 months earlier. Death by firing squad, the sentence to be carried out at a date to be set by the convening authority. The defense counsel filed an immediate appeal for clemency. The grounds were not strong. He argued the defendant's age, prior unblemished service, the absence of military intelligence passed to the enemy, and no profit from the offense. The clemency review took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, Schmidt sat on his wooden stool, ate the cold cabbage soup of the German floor, read the Riga prison Bible, Latvian on one column, German on the other, and wrote letters. He wrote 16 of them to Stephanie. The Wehrmacht prison censor read every one and let every one pass, because Schmid wrote only about ordinary things. The cat. Gertrude's piano lessons. The radio he had been meaning to rewire for his sister-in-law before the war. Stephanie read the letters at her kitchen table in Brigitinau, holding each one up to the window for the light, and wrote 16 letters back. She also wrote one letter to the Wehrmacht clemency office in Berlin that began, "My husband is a good man," and that received no reply. On the 11th of April 1942, the clemency review was rejected. The execution was set for first light on the 13th. He spent the last evening writing the long letter, the one. The Wehrmacht chaplain who sat with him through the night, a Lutheran from Mecklenburg, did not interrupt. Schmid wrote in pencil on 6 sheets of gray prison paper, in his small, careful hand, and the letter was, in its way, the brown ledger one more time. He logged what he had done. He logged what he had been. He listed nothing he was sorry for. On the last page, he asked Stephanie to tell their daughter that her father had been a man, not a coward, and that he hoped someday this would matter to her. He signed it with his full name. Underneath, on its own line, he wrote the sentence the trial record had already preserved. "I only acted as a human being." He folded the letter, he handed it to the chaplain, and asked him to make sure it traveled west. The chaplain carried the letter in his coat for 9 days, took it personally on the train to Berlin, and dropped it into a Vienna-bound postbox at the Anhalter Bahnhof. April 13th, 1942. 6 o'clock in the morning. A small courtyard. 6 soldiers, 6 rifles. The officer in charge unfolds a paper, reads the sentence aloud, refolds it. Anton Schmid stands against the wooden wall in a clean Wehrmacht uniform. He has refused the blindfold. He has refused the post. He has asked instead to be allowed to remain standing on his own feet. He looks past the soldiers at a single window high in the prison wall. The order is given. The volley is short. He could have signed nothing. He could have hidden no one. He could have looked at the floor when the trucks rolled past, or signed the meal vouchers and walked out at 6 in the evening to his Wehrmacht barracks and his cold cabbage soup. He chose the only thing that would kill him. The Viennese training was the rope that hanged him in the end. A man who has spent 20 years writing every transaction in a brown ledger book leaves a record that another man, holding the same brown ledger book in a different city, can read aloud at a tribunal. The book that had become the only proof those people had ever existed was also the book that proved he had taken them out. He had known this on the afternoon he refused to burn it. The refusal was the act. The letter reached Brigitinau in late April. Stephanie was at the kitchen table when the postman came up the stairs. She read the first line, walked to the stove, sat down on the floor of the small kitchen with her back against the warm cast iron, and stayed there for the rest of the afternoon. Gertrude found her at 6. The letter was on the floor between them. The line at the bottom is what Gertrude remembered, for the rest of her own life, when anyone asked what her father had said. The aftermath was not kind. Stephanie was a trader's wife in a city that, for the next 3 years, would still belong to the Reich. Her ration card was downgraded. Her neighbors on the staircase stopped speaking to her in the way neighbors stop speaking when a verdict has been made about a family that does not require argument. The radio shop on Brigitinauer Lende was confiscated and sold to an Aryan buyer at 1/5 of its value. After the war, the buyer refused to return it. Stephanie raised Gertrude on the small pension of a war widow whose husband had been a convicted traitor, which is to say, on almost nothing. Hermann Adler, the Vilna poet, who had spent 4 nights hidden in Schmid's quarters in December 1941 and had been moved out of the city in Hans's lorry the same month, survived the war. He wrote, from Switzerland, a book of poems called Songs from the City of Death. The book was published in 1945. One of the poems was about a Wehrmacht sergeant whose name Adler had been told at the time and had refused to write down, for the sergeant's safety, until he heard that year that the sergeant had been shot 3 years earlier in a Riga courtyard. Stephanie read the book shortly after. She wrote to Adler. He wrote back. Through their letters and through the letters of others, the names of more than 200 survivors began, slowly, to attach themselves to the man on the wooden wall. In 1964, Yad Vashem named Anton Schmid Righteous Among the Nations and planted a carob tree on the Avenue of the Righteous in his memory. Stephanie attended the ceremony in Jerusalem. She was 71 years old. She had not been on an aeroplane before. She wore a black coat and a small gray hat and held a copy of the letter in her handbag. Gertrude stood beside her. The two women planted the tree together. The carob tree is still alive. In 2000, the German Bundeswehr renamed an army base at Rendsburg the Feldwebel Anton Schmid Kaserne. Several veterans associations protested. They said the renaming dishonored other German soldiers. The Minister of Defense, asked whether he would withdraw the name, said only that a soldier who had refused an unlawful order was the kind of soldier the new German army wanted its young recruits to think about. The name stayed. Sometimes a man's only weapon against a great machine is a brown book and a careful hand. Sometimes a man's chance to do the right thing arrives, without warning, in a gutter on a side street in a city he has never seen. Anton Schmid was given his chance on Subocz Street in October 1941. He was given 6 months and a wooden wall in Riga to pay for it. And on a kitchen floor in Brigitonau, a woman read 7 words in pencil and never afterwards needed any other answer about who her husband had been. If this one stayed with you, there are more on the channel. Subscribe if you would like the next one delivered when it lands.